Hey everyone, Dr. Scott here. I wanted to talk about psychospiritual, that term. What is psychospiritual? So, in addition to my work as a therapist, I'm also a psychospiritual coach. And I chose to use that term very intentionally, psychospiritual, because to me of how it's defined, what it implies. So, when we say psychospiritual, it's kind of a way to describe an orientation, a set of theory relating to what spirituality is and how it connects with psychology. So this understanding of spiritual is more specific than the term spiritual is utilized most often in common conversation. So we can talk about, oh, I'm spiritual, this and that. I'm spiritual but not religious, which is, by the way, a very large part of our population identifies as such. So, but that doesn't really give us a descriptor of what that actually means in the context of our lives. Someone could be spiritual but not religious and never actually have, never really define what that is for them and just say that, and it doesn't really impact their day-to-day. Someone could say that I'm spiritual but not religious, and they really live a life where they're, in prayer or meditation or having sort of experiences that allow them to feel connected to something greater. Okay, so we really don't know. There's a spectrum. So the way that I use spiritual has to do with the experience of spirituality. The idea that we aren't just the stories that we tell about ourselves. The idea that that way of understanding ourselves is limited and ultimately dissatisfying, which isn't to say that we shouldn't ever tell stories about ourselves and understand our life as kind of a narrative, just to say that ultimately that experience is dissatisfying. What we want on some deep level is to recognize our connection with all things. This is what we would call transpersonal. And this is what I'm referring to when I'm talking about spiritual experience, transpersonal. The recognition, the actual having a recognition of connection. That there's an experience that goes along with that has nothing to do with the things that we think about ourselves, which is, in maybe conventional terms, the ego is the stories that we tell ourselves. It's an adaptive process that serves a function. I'm not saying it's inherently bad, it just is limited. And ultimately, if that's the only thing we live our life through, it's going to be dissatisfying. So that would be another video. Let's just talk about why psychospiritual really quick. Why the psycho part? So people hear psycho and they think, they think of like, I don't know, the movie or they think it's some kind of bad thing. Psycho just, it's a prefix that denotes a psychological implication. Let's just leave it at that. In this context, psychospiritual to me means that we're also recognizing that spirituality is a psychological process. And that psychology is a spiritual process in that if we follow it to its natural progression, psychology, what we start to get is to transpersonal experience. And that really that view isn't shared by every school of therapy. Some therapies are very reductionistic. They're very mechanical. Even original, like Freudian psychoanalysis isn't necessarily talking, they viewed spiritual experiences sort of regressive or infantile. Now, I think later analysts and theoreticians and practitioners of psychoanalysis started to adjust that. Ultimately, what I'm saying, though, is that it's a specific way of understanding spirituality and psychology. And that it indicates the capacity of us to orient to ourselves in a very clear and direct way around what is the intention here of me investing in myself. What is the connection between my psychology and spirituality? How is psychology, which is so subjective in a way, a doorway to spirituality? And furthermore, also, many historical spiritual practices, they can leave out the personal in favor of transcendence, which is not a bad thing. However, if we want to live in society, if we're not going to renounce society as a renunciate, as a yogi might do, like a traditional sannyasin in India, or a monk, we're not going to renounce, then in a way we have to. And even if we do, in some ways we're still in relationship to society. Especially if we're not going to renounce, though, our relationships are so much a part of who we are, what we do on a day-to-day basis. So if we neglect our psychology, but we only develop our spiritual capacity, we're going to still struggle in relationships, most likely. We're also going to struggle in relationship to our feelings and how our feelings are connected to caring for ourselves in relationships. So I think both are really important, that we learn how to practice each. And so when I say psychospiritual, I mean, well, we're viewing spirituality within a psychological lens, and we're viewing our psychological development within a spiritual lens, and we're taking insights both from a practical, experiential understanding of spirituality, transpersonal, and we're taking insights from psychology, which is more personal, and using those, applying those insights to help us foster a sense of well-being that isn't dependent on achievement or material gain in the way that so much of our society is set up for. It's a totally different way of understanding fulfillment, a totally different way of understanding